Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Pidde with Mickelson and Company. It's a pleasure to be here in Texas. All right, show of hands. What's our audience today? How many railroaders do we have out here? Raise your hand. Okay. How many vendors? Okay. Public officials, economic developers, lawyers? Oh, okay. I like to just see a mix of, who the audience is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the challenges and maybe a solution for what we can do for the short lines. Clayton did a great job talking about short lines, and so I won't spend much time on this other than there's a bunch of short lines, there's a bunch of track miles, and a lot of times these are the small local rural job creators that are keeping your businesses connected to the national freight network, and that's incredibly important. And really, this headline kind of states the obvious, but it's all about the customers. And if the short line railroads do not have the adequate infrastructure to support their customers, they won't be in business. And the biggest challenge that short lines see is how do I maintain this infrastructure? And at the same time, how do I invest based on customer needs and demands? Because it's expensive. But collectively, not only in Texas but across the country, if short lines have an incentive to reinvest, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity that's out there. So this is just a snapshot. I think depending on which contractor or which railroad you talk to, the numbers vary, but I think the point here is it's expensive to maintain track. I think to replace one railroad tie, by the time you buy the tie and insert it, it's $100 a tie. So, anywhere from $1 million and up to construct a mile of track. I think we all know about bridges. They're constantly can be spending time, maintaining them, or if you're going to try to build a new one, it's pretty expensive. But I think if you look at from 1980 to where we're at today, when we had the Staggers Act and the evolution of the short line industry began, there's been a tremendous amount of reinvestment that's taken place, and a lot of it's taken place in the last 5 years, and it's really helped grow the industry. But as we look forward, there's increasing demand for the short line infrastructure to be able to handle 286,000 pound rail cars. And when you look at 90% of the bulk commodities that are moved via rail, that requires having that infrastructure in place. And so you've got that challenge, but one of the things that we see is there's really not, there's some grant programs that are out there, there's some funding programs. It varies state to state depending on the year, depending on the budget cycle, but on a federal level, we don't really have a dedicated freight rail funding program for short lines. There's some discretionary stuff, but the one program that got introduced in 2005 was the short line railroad tax credit, 45G tax credit. And that piece of legislation has resulted in a tremendous amount of growth in our industry. And I think if you talk to Watco and Genesee and Wyoming, T&W, Omnitrax, I think a lot of them would tell you that the growth has been really driven by the tax credit program. The challenge that we have is that for many years the tax credit kind of went like this. We'd maybe have it on for a year and then it would expire and it'd get passed right before Christmas. And so that uncertainty has really created a challenge in terms of how do you plan for your infrastructure when a tax credit gets passed on the 20th of December, retroactive to the beginning of the year. It's hard to plan. The Railway Tie Association's got a pretty interesting statistic that says in the years when the 45G tax credit program was on for an entire year versus getting extended right before Christmas, the industry sold 2 million more ties than they normally would have. So I think that's pretty telling that, when there's something in place, you can do some planning. Tax credit expired 12/31/16. So 2017, there wasn't a tax credit in place. There's still an active discussion in D.C. on, could we extend that credit retroactive to 17 and include 2018? We'll see how that turns out. I think you're all watching the financial press, and depending on the tweet of the day, it's kind of been challenging for this legislation to get passed. So we'll see what happens. But early on when this program got passed, there were a couple states that said, you know what, this is working really, really well. Why don't we try to create our own state-level 45G tax credit program in addition to some of the other grant funding programs that we have? So state of Oklahoma, 2006, they passed the program. It's been around. They've had a couple stops and starts based on budget issues, and historically that's been a 50% credit capped at $2,000 a track mile. It costs the state about $2 million a year, but since the program's inception, it's really generated additional investment and job creation. And I think if you talk to the Rio Grande Pacific Corporation folks in Fort Worth who own the Wichita, Tillman, and Jackson Railroad, they'll say, hey, that's been really significant for our planning, growth, and development. 2009, Kentucky saw the same thing, and they passed a program, and that's been very successful as well. So about a year and a half ago, we started visiting with some of our short line railroad customers and the National Association and said, maybe what we need to consider doing is trying to take this state-level tax credit program and replicate it in other markets. And so there are a lot of different tax credit programs that are out there. There's historic tax credits. There's, wind tax credits. The film tax credit's probably the one that I think a lot of press surrounds. Louisiana passed one in 1992, and that really spurred a lot of film development in the state. In 2002, there were 2 states in the United States that had a state film tax credit program. By 2009, there were 44 states. And I think if you look in the realm of tax credits, I think the railroad tax credit is one that probably has more economic substance tied to that than any other tax credit program that's out there. I feel pretty confident about that. And so we said, let's start looking at seeing if we can replicate the railroad tax credit model similar to what they did with film and others. And so this is what a typical proposal would look like. If we said, hey, how about we mirror this on the federal program? How many are familiar with how the 45G program works? 2. All right, so here's your learning lesson for the day. So the tax credit, when it's available, is a 50% tax credit for what short line spend on qualified railroad track maintenance, capped at $3,500 a track mile. So if I'm a railroad and I got 100 miles of track, I potentially have a $350,000 tax credit, provided that I spend the $700,000 or more on maintenance to generate the credit. The 45G has been unique because you can do one of several things with the credit. You can keep it for your own tax bill, or you can assign it to somebody that you do business with, a shipper or a vendor. And that's what's really spurred a lot of the growth and development. So we said, how about we take this approach, because it's easy to quantify the cost, we know it works, it's proven, we have the data, and let's include an assignability feature to it, and let's see if we can make some progress. So we took a look at how would we go about doing this, and so we started with states with a high concentration of short line railroads, other existing state tax credit markets, so you're not really spending a lot of time educating folks on how tax credits work. But then, what does the budget situation, et cetera, look like? So we looked at it and said, hey, let's take a look at Texas first. And so Jeff and Laura and Clayton and I went up to the Capitol last year and started socializing the concept of a tax credit under the assumption that would probably be in 2019 before we do it. And we got to about our 3rd meeting, and they said, well, why don't you just introduce it now? And I said, okay, we'll do it. So we were a little bit late to the game. Representative Trent Ashby introduced HB 3566. It did not advance due to us being late and also some budget issues, but it really did raise the visibility and awareness of, hey, we need to do something for railroads to help, spur growth, because really what they like is the job story. And so from the Texas experience, we've got 4 states right now where we're going to have legislation introduced in the next few weeks. I think Georgia is getting introduced today. Idaho got introduced yesterday. It was out in Oregon last week. So we're taking the steps to try to replicate this on a state level. And really, to be successful, it's going to take a broad-based grassroots support from the vendors, the folks locally, the shippers, the railroads, because at the end of the day, it's all about jobs. And while this might not be the silver bullet per se, it's certainly something that could be the catalyst for growth. And so we had a long discussion yesterday about how we can try to be successful in Texas for 2019, and that's really starting to do the work now. So if you look at Texas and you're saying, well, gosh, what would this look like? A couple things that jump out is you have a $210 billion budget, roughly, $28 billion for transportation. Of the $28 billion for transportation, there's really not a dedicated freight rail funding source. Now, if you go look at the freight mobility plan, it will outline $40 billion in freight needs for short-line railroads. $40 billion. It's a big number. Let's just say we stretch that out over 20 years. That's $2 billion a year. If we did a state-level tax credit program, there's roughly 40 short lines, 2,900 track miles. That includes mainline, yard track, sidings, etc. It would cost the state $10 million, assuming all the railroads spend the requisite amount of money. That's less than 1% of if you actually went ahead and tried to spend $2 billion a year. So in terms of cost, this should not be the showstopper. It should be saying maybe we should do more. But we think that this is a private sector solution that can drive reinvestment. It's not a handout, and it's something that would allow the railroads to prioritize their freight rail reinvestment needs based on customer demands. So we think this would be a good fit. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take everybody in this room collectively getting behind the effort so that when the session starts next year, we've had kind of a full run at it. So thanks for your attention today, and if you got any questions, we'll be around here, but thank you.